The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often, and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. There's a moment in every person's life when they realize they've been living someone else's dream, while their own soul withers in silence. You stand at your bathroom mirror each morning, looking at a face that seems increasingly foreign, wondering when you became this person who says yes to everything that drains you and no to everything that feeds your spirit. The reflection staring back isn't necessarily unhappy, but there's something missing. A spark that used to burn bright before you learned to dim it for the comfort of others. Nietzsche understood this profound disconnection between who you are and who you've become. He saw how civilization creates what he called the herd mentality, a collective agreement to sacrifice individual authenticity for social harmony. But what looks like peace on the surface is actually a kind of spiritual death, a slow suffocation of everything that makes you uniquely powerful. You weren't born to be comfortable. You weren't designed to fit neatly into categories created by people who lived centuries before you were even a possibility. Yet somewhere along the way, you accepted the premise that your worth depends on how well you can perform the role assigned to you by family, society, religion, or whatever system happened to claim you first. The spirit of gravity that Nietzsche wrote about isn't just a philosophical concept. It's the actual weight you feel in your chest when you're about to compromise yourself again. It's the heaviness that settles in your bones when you choose the safe option instead of the one that makes your heart race with possibility. It's the exhaustion that comes from carrying expectations that were never yours to bear. Most people mistake this weight for maturity, responsibility, or wisdom. They convince themselves that growing up means giving up, that adulthood requires the systematic abandonment of everything that once made them feel alive. But Nietzsche saw through this deception. He recognized that what we call growing up is often just giving in, a gradual surrender to forces that want to make you predictable, manageable, safe. Your mind has been colonized by voices that aren't your own. The inner critic that tells you to be reasonable isn't speaking in your voice. It's channeling the fears and limitations of everyone who raised you, taught you, or claimed authority over your choices. These borrowed thoughts have become so familiar that you mistake them for your own wisdom, but they're actually the bars of an invisible prison. When Nietzsche spoke of master morality versus slave morality, he wasn't talking about political systems or social hierarchies. He was describing two fundamentally different approaches to existence. Slave morality says, I must be good so others will accept me. Master morality says, I will define what good means for my own life. Knowing one seeks permission, the other takes responsibility. You've been trained in slave morality from birth. Every time you were told to be nice instead of honest, to be practical instead of passionate, to consider what others might think before making a choice that could transform your life. You were being programmed to seek external validation for internal decisions. This isn't malicious. Most people teaching you these lessons believe they were protecting you, but protection that prevents growth becomes imprisonment. The will to power that Nietzsche described isn't about dominating others. It's about refusing to be dominated by forces that would diminish your potential. It's the primal drive toward self-actualization, the irrepressible urge to become everything you're capable of becoming. This power isn't something you acquire. It's something you uncover by removing the layers of conditioning that have buried your authentic nature. Think about the last time you felt truly powerful. Not powerful over someone else, but powerful in yourself. It probably wasn't when you were following rules or meeting expectations. It was likely a moment when you acted from your deepest truth, when you chose courage over comfort, when you honored what was real for you, regardless of what others might think. That feeling, that electric aliveness, is your will to power calling you home to yourself. But accessing this power requires confronting everything you've been taught to fear about your own nature. You've been conditioned to believe that your desires are dangerous, that your anger is toxic, that your ambitions are selfish, that your need for authenticity is somehow a betrayal of others. These beliefs don't protect you, they paralyze you. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, often mistranslated as Superman, is really about someone who has overcome these internal limitations. It's not about being superior to others. It's about being superior to your former self. It's about becoming the author of your own values instead of inheriting them from others. It's about creating meaning in your life instead of waiting for it to be delivered to you. This transformation is terrifying because it requires you to question everything you've built your identity around. Your career, your relationships, your beliefs about what makes life worth living. All of it must be examined with fresh eyes. Some of it will survive this scrutiny and become stronger. Much of it will crumble, revealing itself to have been built on foundations of fear rather than truth. The crumbling isn't the problem, it's the solution. When the false structures of your life collapse, space opens for something authentic to emerge. But most people panic at the first sign of this dissolution. They rush to rebuild the familiar prison rather than sitting in the discomfort long enough for genuine freedom to take root. This is where Nietzsche's concept of amor fati becomes crucial. Love of fate, not passive acceptance of whatever happens to you, but active affirmation of your ability to create meaning from whatever life presents. When you can say yes to your entire experience, including the parts that have hurt, disappointed, or challenged you, you stop being a victim of circumstances and become a conscious participant in your own transformation. Your suffering isn't random. The patterns that repeat in your life, the obstacles that keep appearing in different forms, the relationships that trigger the same wounds. These aren't accidents or punishments. They're your psyche's way of bringing unresolved issues to the surface where they can finally be addressed. But instead of looking for the message in the mess, most people just try to avoid the mess altogether. Nietzsche understood that suffering is often the catalyst for consciousness. When life is easy and comfortable, there's little motivation to examine your assumptions or question your direction. But when pain forces you to pay attention, when comfort zones become uncomfortable, when the old ways of coping stop working, you're being invited to evolve. The eternal recurrence that Nietzsche proposed as a thought experiment isn't meant to be taken literally. It's a test of how you're living right now. Could you look at your current life and say, yes, I would choose to live this exact same life over and over again for eternity? If not, what needs to change? What are you tolerating that you shouldn't? What are you avoiding that you need to face? Most people fail this test because they're living lives of quiet desperation, going through motions that feel increasingly meaningless. They're waiting for permission to start living authentically, waiting for the right conditions, waiting for others to change, waiting for a sign that never comes. But the sign you're waiting for is your own willingness to stop waiting. The resentment that builds up from years of self-betrayal doesn't just disappear because you decide to start living differently. This accumulated bitterness becomes what Nietzsche called resentment, a toxic brew of anger, envy, and self-pity that poisons everything it touches. Clearing this requires not just changing your behavior, but forgiving yourself for all the years you spent abandoning yourself. Forgiveness isn't about pretending the past didn't happen or excusing harmful behavior. It's about refusing to let past mistakes determine your future choices. It's about recognizing that every moment of compromise that brought you pain also taught you something valuable about what you will no longer accept. Your history of self-betrayal can become your greatest teacher if you're willing to learn from it instead of just regretting it. The people in your life who benefited from your diminished state won't celebrate your awakening. Those who felt comfortable with your predictability will be threatened by your authenticity. Relationships that were based on your willingness to play small will strain when you start taking up the space you deserve. This isn't their fault or yours. It's just the natural consequence of growth. Some relationships will adapt and become stronger. Others will end, and this ending will hurt even when you know it's necessary. The pain of losing connections that no longer serve you is still pain, but it's clean pain. The kind that leads to healing rather than infection. It's the price of admission to a life that's actually yours. Loneliness is different from solitude. Loneliness is what you feel when you're surrounded by people who don't really see you. Solitude is what you choose when you need space to remember who you are without external input. The journey toward authentic living requires periods of solitude, not as punishment or exile, but as sacred time for reconnection with your deepest self. In solitude, you begin to hear your own voice again. Not the voice that's been trained to say what others want to hear, but the voice that knows what you actually think, feel, want, and believe. This voice may be rusty from disuse, hesitant from years of being silenced, but it's still there waiting for you to trust it enough to listen. Creativity is one of the first casualties of a life lived according to fear, and one of the first things to return when you start living according to truth. The creative impulse doesn't just apply to art. It's your capacity to generate novel solutions, to see possibilities others miss, to bring something new into existence through the force of your unique perspective. When you stop trying to be what others expect and start being what you are, your creative power explodes. You see opportunities where others see obstacles. You find connections that others miss. You approach old problems with fresh energy because you're no longer constrained by conventional thinking about what's possible. This creative renaissance isn't just personally fulfilling, it's your gift to the world. The perspective that emerges from your authentic journey is something only you can offer. Your specific combination of experiences, insights, and capacities creates a unique lens through which to see and respond to life. When you hide this lens behind masks of conformity, everyone loses. The courage to be authentic in a world that rewards conformity is perhaps the most radical act available to a human being. You're not just changing your own life. You're demonstrating to everyone who witnesses your transformation that another way of living is possible. Your example becomes permission for others to examine their own lives more honestly. This influence happens not through preaching or convincing, but through embodiment. When people encounter someone who is genuinely authentic, who has aligned their outer life with their inner truth, who radiates the confidence that comes from self-acceptance, they can't help but wonder what that might feel like. Your freedom becomes an invitation for others to explore their own. But this influence only works if your transformation is real, not performative. People can sense the difference between someone who has done the work of becoming authentic and someone who is simply acting out a new role. The energy is completely different. One is magnetic, the other is repelling. The magnetic quality of authentic presence comes from integration, the harmony between your inner experience and outer expression. When what you think, feel, say, and do are aligned, you generate a kind of personal power that draws people toward you. Not because you're trying to impress them, but because you're not trying to be anything other than yourself. This integration is the opposite of the fragmentation that characterizes most people's lives. How many versions of yourself do you maintain? The work version, the family version, the social version, the private version, each with its own rules, expectations, and limitations. Living this way requires enormous energy because you're constantly monitoring which version to present in each situation. Authenticity simplifies everything. When you're the same person in every context, when your values and boundaries remain consistent regardless of who's watching, when you speak your truth regardless of whether it's convenient, life becomes much less complicated. You no longer need to remember which story you told to whom or which version of yourself you're supposed to be. This consistency doesn't mean rigidity. Authentic people are actually more flexible than those trapped in roles because they're responding to reality rather than to scripts. They can adapt to new situations without losing themselves because they know who they are beneath the circumstances. The fear that stops most people from embracing authenticity is the fear of rejection. What if people don't like the real you? What if your truth is too much for others to handle? What if honesty leads to conflict, judgment, or abandonment? These are legitimate concerns, and the answer isn't to pretend they're not real or important. The answer is to recognize that the alternative, living as someone you're not in order to be accepted, is actually a form of self-rejection. When you hide your true self to avoid rejection from others, you're guaranteed rejection from the person whose opinion matters most. You're trading authentic connection for the illusion of acceptance. Real acceptance can only happen when real you is present to be accepted. Everything else is just role-playing. And while role-playing might be safer, it's also hollow. The approval you receive for performing isn't really for you. It's for the character you're playing. Deep down, you know this, which is why external validation never quite satisfies the hunger for genuine connection. The path from fear to freedom isn't about eliminating all fear. It's about changing your relationship with fear. Fear will always be part of the human experience. The question is whether fear is your master or your advisor. Does it make your decisions for you, or does it simply provide information that you consider as you make your own choices? When fear is your master, you avoid anything that triggers it. Your life becomes smaller and smaller as you eliminate more and more possibilities in service of staying comfortable. When fear is your advisor, you feel it, acknowledge it, learn what it has to teach you, and then decide for yourself what action to take. This shift from being controlled by fear to being informed by it is perhaps the most practical application of Nietzsche's philosophy. You don't need to become fearless. You need to become fearless. Less dominated by fear, less limited by it, less willing to let it be the final word on what you do with your life. The freedom that starts where fear ends isn't a destination you arrive at once and then possess forever. It's a practice, a daily choice, a moment-by-moment decision to honor what's true for you rather than what's expected of you. Some days you'll choose courage. Some days you'll choose comfort. The goal isn't perfection, it's consciousness. Consciousness means knowing what you're choosing and why. When you choose safety over growth, do it consciously rather than automatically. When you choose comfort over truth, acknowledge the choice rather than pretending you have no option. When you choose fear over freedom, at least be honest about what you're doing. This consciousness eventually becomes uncomfortable with choices that betray your authentic nature. Not because you should feel guilty, but because you've tasted what it feels like to live aligned with your truth. And anything less starts to feel like wearing clothes that don't fit. The discomfort motivates better choices not through shame, but through the natural preference for what feels right. Your authentic self is not a fixed entity waiting to be discovered. It's a dynamic expression of your deepest values, desires, and capacities as they evolve over time. The person you are at 40 may be very different from who you were at 20. And that's not just acceptable, it's necessary. Growth requires the willingness to let old versions of yourself die so new ones can be born. This process of conscious evolution is what Nietzsche meant by self-overcoming. You don't overcome yourself by rejecting who you've been, but by integrating the lessons of your past into the person you're becoming. Every mistake you've made, every compromise you've accepted, every time you've betrayed yourself, all of it becomes raw material for wisdom if you're willing to learn from it rather than just regret it. The goal isn't to become someone else. It's to become more fully yourself, to strip away the layers of conditioning, expectation, and fear that have obscured your natural radiance, to remember what it feels like to move through the world as yourself rather than as the performance of yourself you've been giving for so long. When you finally make this return to authenticity, when you finally choose yourself with the same devotion you've given to pleasing others, something magical happens. The world doesn't end. People don't abandon you en masse. The sky doesn't fall. Instead, you discover that the catastrophes you were trying to avoid by staying small were mostly imaginary, while the life you were afraid to claim was waiting for you all along. Freedom starts where fear ends, because fear's primary function is to keep you safe. And safety, while important, is not the same as aliveness. You can be safe and miserable, safe and unfulfilled, safe and slowly dying inside. Freedom requires the willingness to trade guaranteed safety for the possibility of a life that actually belongs to you. This is Nietzsche's hard truth. You are more powerful than you've been taught to believe, more capable than you've been allowed to know, more responsible for your experience than you've been willing to accept. This power isn't something you need to earn or deserve. It's your birthright as a conscious being capable of choice. The question isn't whether you have this power. You do. The question is whether you'll claim it, whether you'll do the work of becoming who you are, whether you'll pay the price of freedom, which is the willingness to disappoint people who prefer you powerless. Your story is waiting to be written by the only person qualified to write it. You, not the you who's been trained to please everyone else, but the you who remembers what it feels like to be authentically, unapologetically, magnificently yourself. That person is still in there, waiting for the courage to emerge. Freedom starts where fear ends. Your freedom starts the moment you decide that being yourself is worth whatever price you have to pay for the privilege. The only question left is, what are you waiting for?